Silk and spices were not the only treasures moving across ancient Asia. The real story is how the roads that carried them also carried entire religions. Long before planes or trains, the vast trade networks of the continent acted as the primary arteries for belief, weaving faiths like Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity into the cultural fabric of distant lands. This video will show you exactly how ideas traveled at the speed of commerce, revealing a hidden map of spiritual exchange that shaped half the world. We will walk with monks along dusty caravan tracks and sail with merchants on monsoon winds to answer a profound question. How did abstract concepts of faith carried by ordinary travelers manage to take root in places thousands of miles from their birth? By the end, you will understand the invisible forces that connected spiritual landscapes, a process far more intricate and human than any conquest. This journey uncovers the symbiotic dance between the marketplace and the monastery, a relationship that built bridges of understanding across immense divides. So what does it truly mean for a belief to travel? Asia was a world of impossible distances and profound isolation. To cross its expanse meant confronting the roof of the world in the Himalayas, the endless sea of grass on the steppe, and the punishing emptiness of deserts like the Taklamakan, whose very name whispered a warning. It was a landscape that did not encourage casual travel, yet within this forbidding geography, nature provided a few critical passages. River valleys carved natural highways. Mountain passes like the fabled Khyber offered narrow gates between empires, and seasonal wind patterns, the monsoons, dictated the rhythm of oceanic travel. These were not just features on a map, they were the predetermined corridors and choke points that funneled all movement, including the movement of ideas. Into these corridors stepped travelers carrying more than silk or pepper. They carried the foundational texts of Buddhism, seeking peace beyond suffering. They carried the teachings of Islam, a faith of community and submission. They carried the message of Christianity, woven into the traditions of Eastern churches. Hinduism moved with cultural influence across the seas, while Zoroastrianism and later Sikhism added their own threads to the tapestry. Think of these belief systems not as abstract philosophies, but as a kind of precious, living cargo. They were packaged in the minds of monks, the rituals of merchants, the translated pages of sacred texts, and the shared stories told around caravan campfires. Our journey is to track how this specific cargo, belief itself, hitched a ride on the world's oldest and most resilient transportation network. This network of predetermined corridors had a name, one that still echoes with mystery and romance. We call it the Silk Road, but that famous label is misleading in two crucial ways. First, it was never a single road, but a sprawling, shifting web of interconnected trails. Second, and more importantly for our story, silk was just one thread in a far richer tapestry. The true cargo that reshaped continents was belief. To understand how religions traveled, we must first understand the anatomy of this ancient internet. Picture two vast, parallel systems working in tandem. Overland, the route snaked across the Central Asian steppes, a grassy sea navigated by hardy caravan trains. These trails connected the great settled empires of China, Persia, and the Mediterranean. But equally vital were the maritime routes, the sea roads that harnessed the predictable monsoon winds. Ships from the Arabian Peninsula and India sailed to the ports of Southeast Asia and China, carrying goods and ideas in their holds. This was not a simple east-west line on a map. It was a dynamic, multi-directional network where a Buddhist text from India could reach a monastery in China by land, while a Nestorian Christian priest from Persia might arrive in a Chinese port by sea. The Silk Road provided the physical infrastructure, the literal path upon which every subsequent story of religious transmission would walk. It was the superhighway, but the vehicles were people, and their most precious freight was invisible. The journey of Buddhism offers our clearest blueprint for how a faith could travel such impossible distances. It moved not as a sudden conquest, but as a slow, deliberate migration of ideas, carried person by person and translated word by word. The process began with monks, the intrepid scholars and pilgrims who became the primary couriers of their faith. They did not travel light. Their cargo was intellectual, vast libraries of sacred texts known as sutras, which contained the core teachings of the Buddha. For this knowledge to take root in new soil, it first had to be understood. This made translation the single most critical act of religious transmission along the Silk Road. Monastic communities in oasis towns like Dunhuang or Turfan became bustling translation bureaus. Teams of scholars, often a foreign monk working with a local linguist, would spend years meticulously rendering Sanskrit or Pali texts into local languages like Sogdian, the lingua franca of Central Asian merchants, and eventually into classical Chinese. This was not mere word-for-word substitution. It was a profound act of cultural interpretation, finding Chinese philosophical terms like Tao or the Way to express Buddhist concepts. Without this painstaking work of translation, making the teachings accessible and relatable, Buddhism would have remained a foreign curiosity, unable to sink deep roots. But who funded these long years of scholarly work, and who protected the monks on their perilous journeys? The answer lies with the merchant communities. Buddhist teachings, with their emphasis on karma, ethical conduct, and support for the monastic community, resonated powerfully with traders. A merchant's life was one of constant risk, navigating bandits, storms, and uncertain markets. The idea that ethical business could generate positive karma for future lives offered both spiritual comfort and a practical moral framework. In return, wealthy merchant families and guilds became devoted patrons. They donated funds to build monasteries and cave temples along the trade routes, which served a dual purpose. For the monks, they were libraries and translation centers. For the merchants, they were spiritual way stations, banks, and secure warehouses. A merchant could deposit funds at a monastery in one oasis and withdraw equivalent value at another branch further down the road, a primitive but effective banking system built on religious trust. This symbiotic relationship propelled Buddhism forward, with merchant caravans literally bankrolling the faith's geographic expansion. The political landscape of Central Asia provided the final, crucial catalyst. The Kushan Empire, which controlled key Silk Road territories around 2,000 years ago, offers a perfect example. Its rulers, particularly the great Emperor Kanishka, did not just tolerate Buddhism. They actively championed it, convening monumental councils to standardize teachings and sponsoring a breathtaking flourish of art and architecture. Under such imperial patronage, Gandharan art was born, fusing Greek artistic techniques inherited from Alexander the Great's legacy with Buddhist subjects to create the first ever statues of the Buddha. This visual language made the faith instantly more accessible than abstract texts alone. With royal backing, the monastic merchant network could operate on an unprecedented scale, turning the Silk Road into a true Buddhist highway. Yet perhaps no single story captures the human scale of this transmission better than the pilgrimage of the monk Xuanzang in the 7th century. His 17-year odyssey from China to India and back was a one-man knowledge transfer mission. Braving deserts and mountains, he studied at the source, collected hundreds of sutras, and returned to China not with an army but with cartloads of texts. His subsequent translation work, supported by the Tang Emperor, shaped Chinese Buddhism for centuries. His journey reminds us that behind the grand narratives of empires and trade, religions traveled through the sheer will and devotion of individuals. They walked, they translated, and they built bridges of understanding one step at a time. So if the Silk Road was the highway, then translation was the vehicle, merchant patronage was the fuel, and royal support was the favorable wind that filled the sails. Buddhism's journey shows us that faith moved not by force, but by a powerful alignment of spiritual seeking, economic interest, and political opportunity. While monks and emperors shaped the journey of faith, the everyday engine of this exchange was a people you may have never heard of. The Sogdians, based in the fertile valleys of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, were not empire builders in the traditional sense. They were something far more influential for the flow of ideas. They were the ultimate middlemen, the neutral brokers who connected every major power along the Silk Road. From their legendary cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, Sogdian merchant networks stretched like a delicate, resilient web from the Byzantine Empire in the west all the way to the capital of Tang, China in the east. They did not just move goods, they moved cultures, and within their caravans and their far-flung communities, they carried a unique religious portfolio. A single Sogdian trading family might include members who practiced Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian faith of their homeland, alongside others who had adopted Buddhism from their Eastern contacts, or Nestorian Christianity from the West, or even the newer faith of Manichaeism. This was not confusion, but a profound and pragmatic adaptability. Their success depended on being able to do business with anyone, anywhere, and understanding the spiritual landscape was as crucial as knowing the exchange rates. So they became multilingual and multi-religious, not out of a lack of conviction, but as a strategy for survival and connection. This made their diaspora communities, the small Sogdian quarters established in oasis towns and major Chinese cities, into something extraordinary. They were not just ethnic enclaves, they were interfaith hubs, living libraries of belief. In a Sogdian caravan stop, you might find a Zoroastrian fire temple, a small Nestorian Christian chapel, and a Buddhist stupa, all within the same neighborhood, serving the spiritual needs of travelers from across the known world. The Sogdians were the connective tissue. Their linguistic skill was legendary. Many were fluent in Sogdian, Persian, Chinese, and various Turkic languages, acting as the essential translators and diplomats between empires. When a Buddhist sutra needed to move from Sanskrit to Chinese, it often passed through a Sogdian intermediary translation. When a Nestorian Christian priest, a figure we will meet soon, wanted to present his faith to the Chinese emperor, it was often a Sogdian merchant who arranged the introduction and provided translation. They provided the neutral ground and the practical means for religions to cross cultural borders without the baggage of political conquest. Think of them as the original global citizens, whose identity was rooted less in a single empire or a single faith, and more in the vast, interconnected network of commerce and communication they maintained. Their legacy is a quiet one, woven into the fabric of countless cultures rather than stamped on monuments. But by choosing to be bridges, by hosting a marketplace of ideas in their very communities, the Sogdians ensured that the Silk Road remained open to more than just silk. It remained open to the soul, and it was across one of the bridges they helped maintain that a very different faith would make its own astonishing journey eastward. While the Sogdians were masters of navigating multiple faiths, one religion in particular seemed tailor-made for their world of movement and connection. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, did not just travel the Silk Road, it was arguably born of it. Mani himself designed his faith for export, declaring it the final, universal synthesis of all previous world religions, weaving together threads of Zoroastrian light and darkness, Christian ethics, and Buddhist cycles of rebirth. This was not a faith tied to a single people or a holy land. Its very structure was portable, its message deliberately syncretic, meant to resonate with the diverse audiences a merchant would meet from Rome to China. Its cosmology was a grand drama of light trapped in the material world, and the path to liberation was through strict asceticism for its elect class, and devoted support from its lay followers, the auditors. And who were the ideal auditors? Merchants. The Manichaean community relied entirely on the patronage of its lay believers to provide food, shelter, and protection for its ascetic elect, who could not farm or engage in commerce. In return, the merchants received spiritual merit and a clear, dualistic moral framework that made sense of a chaotic world. This created a perfect symbiosis. Manichaean communities sprang up not in remote countryside, but precisely in the major trading hubs and oasis cities where wealth and ideas converged. You would find them in Roman Carthage, in Byzantine Alexandria, in Sogdian Samarkand, and eventually in the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an. It became, in essence, a merchant's faith, its network mirroring the trade routes themselves. For centuries, it thrived in this niche, a transnational belief system existing in the spaces between empires. But this very success, its refusal to be bound to any one culture or ruler, eventually made it a target. From the late Roman Empire to Tang China, powerful states began to see this borderless faith as a threat to their own authority and social order. It was persecuted, branded as heresy, and driven underground. Yet its story does not end there. The persecution of Manichaeism demonstrates a fascinating reverse principle of religious transmission. When a faith is squeezed out of one area, its adherents and ideas don't just vanish, they flow along the very channels they know best, the trade routes. Chinese records show Manichaean communities persisting for centuries in southeastern port cities, maintaining their identity long after being purged from the imperial center. Its ideas subtly influenced other movements, and a single, remarkable manuscript discovery in the deserts of China proves its reach. The faith designed for the road found its last resting place in a time capsule buried beneath the sands, a testament to its incredible journey. Manichaeism shows us that the Silk Road could sustain a belief system that had no imperial army, no royal patron, and no homeland, surviving purely on the devotion of its networked followers. It was a religion of the in-between spaces, and for a time it made the entire trading world its home. Manichaeism's fate proved that a faith could travel without a homeland, but what about one that was actively pushed away from its own? At the very western end of the Silk Road, a profound theological debate within the early Christian church was about to send ripples all the way to China. In the 5th century, a patriarch of Constantinople named Nestorius proposed a nuanced interpretation of the nature of Christ, emphasizing the distinction between his human and divine aspects. His views were declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431, and his followers faced intense pressure within the Byzantine Empire. Yet rather than disappearing, the Nestorian Church, as it came to be known, did something remarkable. It turned east, finding refuge and a new future in the Persian Sasanian Empire. This was a strategic masterstroke. By positioning themselves as a distinct Christian community separate from the Byzantine Church, the Nestorians removed any suspicion of being a fifth column for Rome, their Persian rivals. They were granted protection, and their center of gravity shifted to cities like Seleucia-Ctesiphon. From this secure base, they looked not back toward the Mediterranean, but outward along the Silk Road. Nestorian missionaries, often skilled in medicine and astronomy, became a familiar presence in Sogdian merchant communities. They traveled not as conquering evangelists, but as scholars and healers, offering valuable skills that opened doors. Their journey east was a slow, patient migration of communities rather than a rapid conversion campaign. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Nestorian bishoprics or dioceses were established in Merv, Samarkand, and Herat, dotting the map of Central Asia. They were writing their theology in Syriac, a form of Aramaic, but speaking to their neighbors in Sogdian or Persian. This pattern of adaptation was their greatest strength. When they finally reached the court of the Tang dynasty in China in the 7th century, they did not present their faith as a foreign imposition. They called it the Luminous religion, a name resonating with light and wisdom. To explain their beliefs, they did not import untranslatable Greek or Latin terms. Instead, they borrowed from the spiritual vocabulary already familiar to Chinese scholars. In their texts, God became Buddha, angels became Dharma, and salvation was described using concepts from Taoism. Their churches, recorded in Chinese sources, were not called churches but Persian temples. This was not a dilution of their faith, but a brilliant act of translation, seeking to express eternal truths in a language the local culture could hear and understand. For over 200 years, the Luminous religion thrived under Tang patronage, a fact we know not from vague legends, but from one of the most staggering pieces of evidence ever unearthed from the Silk Road. In the early 17th century, near the city of Xi'an, workers dug up a massive limestone slab over 9 feet tall. Carved in the year 781, it was the Xi'an stele. Its headline, in elegant Chinese characters, proclaimed the arrival and propagation of the Luminous religion in the Middle Kingdom. The stele tells the entire story in both Chinese and Syriac. It recounts how a missionary named Alopan arrived at the Tang capital in 635, presented sacred books and images to the emperor, and was granted permission to teach. It lists bishops and priests with both Syriac and Chinese names. It even includes a Christian cross rising from a cloud, resting atop a Buddhist lotus flower, a perfect visual symbol of this cultural synthesis. The stele is a monument to coexistence, proving that a branch of Christianity had not only reached China, but had been officially welcomed, studied, and practiced centuries before Marco Polo or any European missionary ever set foot there. Its discovery shocked the world, offering irrefutable stone-carved proof that the exchange of religion was a two-way street across Asia. The Nestorian journey shows us that a faith could be resilient enough to transform exile into opportunity. By moving east, by translating their message into the conceptual language of Buddhism and Taoism, they built bridges where others might have built walls. They demonstrate that the most successful spiritual travelers were not those who demanded change from their new homes, but those who were wise enough to change how they spoke. While the Nestorians were carving their story in stone in China, another current of belief was moving not across deserts, but across the open sea. The overland Silk Road was only half the story of Asia's connectivity. To its south lay a vast liquid highway, the Indian Ocean, governed not by caravans but by the relentless rhythm of the wind. For half the year, the monsoon blew steadily from the southwest, and for the other half, it reversed to blow from the northeast. This predictable seasonal pulse allowed sailors to plan journeys of astonishing distance, knowing they could sail one way with the wind at their back and return months later with the wind reversed. This was not just a trade route, it was a clockwork system of exchange, and it created a string of cosmopolitan ports that became the maritime equivalents of Silk Road oases. From the vibrant Swahili city-states of East Africa like Kilwa and Mogadishu, to the great emporiums of India's Malabar coast such as Calicut and Cambay, across to the strategic straits of Malacca and the bustling ports of Java, all the way to the southern Chinese hub of Quanzhou, these cities thrived on the monsoon schedule. They were melting pots where Arab-how captains met Gujarati merchants, Javanese sailors traded with Chinese officials, and Persian scholars debated with local rulers. And just like the caravanserais on land, these ports did not just exchange pepper, cloves, and porcelain. They became crucibles for faith. The maritime routes operated as a parallel and deeply interconnected system for religious transmission, often more fluid and continuous than the overland journeys. A merchant ship sailing from the Persian Gulf to Guangzhou carried in its hold not only goods, but also the prayers, texts, and traditions of its crew and passengers. When these ships docked for months, waiting for the winds to change, their communities put down temporary roots, building shrines, marrying local women, and sharing their practices. This constant, cyclical movement created a slow, persistent diffusion of belief along the coastlines. It was across this aqueous web that two great religions would find their most expansive pathways, carried not by monks or imperial decree, but by the everyday rhythms of commerce and the wind. Hinduism would ride the cultural prestige of Indian kingdoms to Southeast Asia, while Islam would demonstrate a unique flexibility, spreading through the networks of Muslim merchants who became the indispensable middlemen of the Indian Ocean world. The stage was set for a different kind of conversion, one born not in the silence of the desert, but in the salty air of the world's greatest sea. The monsoon winds carried more than just spices and silk to the shores of Southeast Asia. They brought an entire cultural world, Indian merchants sailing eastward to the kingdoms of Funan, Srivijaya, and later the Khmer Empire did not travel as isolated traders. They arrived as representatives of a sophisticated civilization, carrying with them the prestige of ancient texts, complex rituals, and a powerful new vocabulary of kingship. This was not a migration of armies, but a migration of ideas, and it gave rise to what scholars call the Sanskrit Cosmopolis. Imagine a vast network of ports and courts, from modern-day Vietnam to the islands of Indonesia, all connected not by a single political ruler, but by a shared elite language, Sanskrit, and a shared set of religious and political concepts borrowed from India. Local rulers in Southeast Asia did not see Indian culture as a foreign imposition. They actively imported it, inviting Brahmin priests, architects, and scholars to their courts. Why? Because Indian traditions offered a powerful toolkit for state building. Concepts like the Devaraja, the god-king, where the ruler was seen as an earthly embodiment of Shiva or Vishnu, provided a divine justification for royal authority. Sanskrit became the language of courtly ceremony and official inscriptions, much like Latin in medieval Europe, lending an air of timeless legitimacy to new dynasties. This was a voluntary and selective adoption. Southeast Asian rulers picked the elements that resonated with their own world, blending them with indigenous ancestor worship and spirit beliefs to create something entirely new. The process was gradual, taking centuries, and it was cemented not by conquest, but by the continuous, cyclical journey of ships along the monsoon routes. Priests and artisans would travel with merchant fleets, their passage sponsored by wealthy guilds or by the receiving kings themselves, creating a slow, persistent cultural infusion that transformed the landscape. Nowhere is this fusion more breathtakingly visible than in the stone. Consider the Temple Mountain of Borobudur on the island of Java, built in the 9th century. From a distance, it is a massive Buddhist mandala, a cosmic diagram in stone, its terraces leading pilgrims on a spiritual journey toward enlightenment. But look closer, its intricate relief panels do not just tell the life of the Buddha. They depict the everyday life of ancient Java, its ships, its marketplaces, its dancers. Borobudur is not an Indian temple transplanted onto foreign soil. It is a Javanese vision of the universe expressed through the architectural language of Buddhism. Similarly, Angkor Wat, the crowning achievement of the Khmer Empire, is superficially a vast temple to the Hindu god Vishnu. Its soaring towers are modeled after the mythical Mount Meru, the center of the Hindu cosmos. Yet its bas-reliefs proudly chronicle the military processions and royal ceremonies of the Khmer king Suryavarman II. The moat surrounding it mirrors the cosmic ocean, but it also served as a massive reservoir for Angkor's ingenious water management system. This is the key. These monuments were not mere copies. They were profound statements of local identity and power, using the imported spiritual vocabulary of India to tell a distinctly Southeast Asian story. They show us that the transmission of religion across the sea was never a one-way broadcast. It was a creative collaboration where the sacred geography of India was remapped onto the rivers and jungles of a new world, creating hybrid masterpieces that still awe us today. This maritime network of ideas set a powerful precedent, proving that faith could travel across water with the same transformative power as it did across sand. And it was along these same watery highways that another faith would soon arrive, one whose traders would weave it into the very fabric of port city life from Africa to Indonesia. The monsoon winds that carried Hinduism and Buddhism to Southeast Asia would soon bring a new spiritual current, one that arrived not with royal envoys but in the holds of trading ships. The early spread of Islam beyond the deserts of Arabia is a story often overshadowed by tales of empires and conquests, but its most enduring and peaceful expansion was driven by a far quieter force, the merchant's ledger. In the 7th and 8th centuries, as Muslim political power consolidated, a parallel and profoundly influential migration was underway. Arab and later Persian Muslim traders, following routes their pre-Islamic ancestors had known for centuries, began sailing eastward from the Gulf and the Red Sea and traveling northward along the Silk Road into Central Asia. They were not missionaries by profession, but their faith was a part of their identity, carried in their daily prayers, their dietary laws, and their ethical business practices. Wherever their commerce took them, they established small, settled communities. In the bustling port cities of the Indian Ocean, places like Cambay in India, Malacca in the Malay Peninsula, and Quanzhou in China, these traders would often wait for months for the monsoon winds to reverse. During these long stays, they married local women, built homes, and erected simple mosques that served as both places of worship and community centers. These neighborhoods became permanent nodes in a vast, interconnected web. The same pattern unfolded along the overland caravan routes through Central Asia. In oasis towns like Merv, Bukhara, and Samarkand, Muslim merchant quarters grew alongside Sogdian, Nestorian, and Buddhist districts. This created a fascinating social landscape. Conversion to Islam in these early centuries was rarely a sudden, dramatic event. It was a gradual process, often spanning generations, and it worked through social prestige and practical necessity. A local ruler might see an advantage in aligning with a wealthy and well-connected Muslim trading network. A local merchant might convert to join a powerful commercial guild that operated on shared Islamic legal principles, making contracts and partnerships far simpler. Intermarriage was perhaps the most powerful engine of all. When a Muslim merchant married a local woman, their children were typically raised Muslim, creating a new generation that was culturally blended but religiously part of the growing Ummah, or global community of believers. The faith offered a compelling package, a clear, monotheistic message, a straightforward legal system for business and community life, and a sense of belonging to a vast, cosmopolitan network that stretched from Spain to the South China Sea. This was a faith of the marketplace and the docks, spreading through persuasion, example, and everyday interaction. Its success lay in its portability and its practicality, proving that the most durable conversions often happen not at the point of a sword, but at the crossroads of trust and trade. But the story of Islam's journey is not complete with the merchants alone. A deeper, more personal wave of faith followed in their footsteps, carried by a different kind of traveler. These were the Sufi mystics, men and women who sought a direct, ecstatic connection with the divine. They were not scholars of legal texts, but poets, healers, and storytellers, and they became the most effective ambassadors of Islam in the heart of Asia. While merchants established the physical communities, the Sufis provided their spiritual heart. They traveled the same caravan tracks, often under the protection of the very trade guilds whose members sought their blessing. Their path was one of personal devotion, emphasizing love, music, and inner experience over rigid doctrine. This made their message incredibly flexible and adaptable. To a nomadic herder on the steppes, the Sufi mystic might speak of God's presence in the vastness of the sky. To a settled farmer in an oasis, they might use local legends and folklore to illustrate spiritual truths. They did not demand that people abandon their entire world, but instead wove Islamic concepts into the existing cultural tapestry. The Sufi masters, or Pirs, established lodges known as khanqahs along trade routes. These were not just monasteries, but hospices, community centers, and safe havens for all travelers. A weary merchant, a curious local, and a wandering seeker could all find food, shelter, and conversation there. Through this hospitality, built on genuine human connection, trust was forged. The Sufi emphasis on a personal, loving God and the possibility of a direct relationship offered a powerful, accessible spirituality that resonated deeply with populations for whom formal, urban-based Islam might have felt distant and foreign. Their brotherhoods, or tariqas, became networks of influence that transcended political borders, creating bonds of loyalty that were often stronger than ties to any distant caliph or sultan. In places like the Punjab and Sindh in South Asia, and across the Turkic lands of Central Asia, it was the Sufis, with their tombs becoming centers of pilgrimage and veneration, who cemented Islam into the local spiritual landscape. They completed the work the merchants began, proving that the most enduring conversions are those that speak not to law, but to the human heart. Yet for all the quiet, patient work of merchants and mystics, a single, earth-shaking event in the 13th century would supercharge the entire system. The rise of the Mongol Empire was a cataclysm that tore apart the old political order, but in its wake, it forged something entirely new. A single, unified zone of travel and communication stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. This was not merely another chapter in the story of religious exchange. It was the moment the story went from a steady walk to a full sprint. The Mongol conquests, while undeniably devastating, created a paradoxical outcome known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For the first time in history, a traveler could journey from Beijing to Baghdad under the protection of a single, overarching authority. The Mongol Khans, from Genghis to Kublai, understood that their vast wealth depended on the smooth flow of commerce. They ruthlessly suppressed banditry, standardized trade regulations, and established a revolutionary relay system of horse stations, the Yam, which functioned as a continental postal service. Messengers, merchants, and diplomats could now cover distances in weeks that once took months or even years. The routes were not just safe, they were officially maintained highways. This security blanket had a direct and profound impact on the movement of belief. Religious specialists who had always been part of the traffic now traveled with a frequency and freedom that was previously unimaginable. The Mongol court itself became the ultimate interfaith salon. The Khans followed a steppe tradition of pragmatic religious tolerance. They consulted with Buddhist lamas, Muslim scholars, Nestorian Christian priests, and Taoist sages, often holding debates to determine which faith held the greatest power or truth. This was not modern multiculturalism, but a calculated policy. They believed in harnessing the spiritual power of all the gods for the benefit of their empire. This open atmosphere at the very top sent a clear message down the routes. Belief was a permissible, even encouraged form of travel. Two remarkable journeys moving in opposite directions perfectly illustrate this accelerated world. First, consider the Nestorian monk Rabban Bar Soma. Born in Beijing, he set out from China in the 1270s with a dream of making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Traveling under the Pax Mongolica, he crossed Central Asia, visited the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia, and eventually became an envoy for the Persian Mongol ruler, traveling to Constantinople, Rome, and even meeting the King of France. His mission was to propose a military alliance between the Mongols and the Europeans. but his very presence in these courts as a Christian from the Far East was a stunning testament to the new connectivity. His journey shows a religious identity that was fluid and transnational, moving effortlessly across what were once impermeable civilizational borders. Moving in the other direction was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. His famous travels to the court of Kublai Khan were only possible because the Mongol peace secured the overland routes. His accounts, though often debated, are filled with observations of this religious marketplace. He describes Buddhist temples, Muslim mosques, and Nestorian churches standing side by side in Chinese cities, and notes Kublai Khan's curiosity about Christianity, even sending Polo's father and uncle back to Europe with a request for the Pope to send 100 learned men to teach him. The empire had become a grand concourse where every faith was a potential guest at the table. This period of intense exchange did not mean all beliefs were treated equally, but it meant they were all in motion, competing, blending, and being observed as never before. The Mongol Empire did not create the Silk Road, but it plugged it into a higher voltage. By guaranteeing safety and incentivizing movement, it turned the slow, organic seep of ideas into a deliberate, rapid flow. It was the great accelerator, proving that when the paths are cleared, the most profound thing to travel is not what you carry in your packs, but what you carry in your mind. The Mongol peace created a spiritual marketplace, and one faith would emerge as the ultimate political partner. Tibetan Buddhism, with its unique fusion of monastic discipline, esoteric rituals, and sophisticated political theory, found a perfect audience in the Mongol ruling class. This was not a conversion of the masses, but a strategic alliance forged at the highest levels, creating a new religious axis that would reshape the spiritual geography of Inner Asia. The initial connection was made by the great Mongol Prince Gandharan, a grandson of Genghis Khan in the 1240s, seeking spiritual guidance and a means to administer his newly conquered Tibetan territories. He invited the prominent scholar and abbot Sakya Pandita to his court. This was a diplomatic masterstroke. Sakya Pandita traveled from Tibet with his young nephew, Phagpa, and their meeting established a revolutionary template, the priest-patron relationship known in Tibetan as Che-Yuen. In this arrangement, the Tibetan Lama offered religious sanctification and spiritual counsel to the Mongol ruler, who in turn provided military protection and political authority to the Lama's school. It was a mutual exchange of legitimacy, power for blessings. This bond was cemented a generation later when Phagpa, now a leading Lama himself, became the spiritual guide to Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. Kublai, needing a unifying ideology to rule his diverse empire, formally adopted Tibetan Buddhism as the court religion. He elevated Phagpa to the position of imperial preceptor, granting him authority over all religious affairs in Tibet and immense influence within the Mongol administration. In a symbolic act of profound significance, Phagpa is said to have performed a consecration ceremony for Kublai, not as a subject to an emperor, but as a spiritual master to a disciple. This relationship transformed the flow of ideas. Suddenly, the remote monasteries of the Tibetan plateau became centers of gravity. Mongol princes and nobles began sending their sons to be educated in Tibetan monastic universities. Tibetan artists, architects, and doctors traveled north to the Mongol courts, bringing their distinctive styles and knowledge. The iconic Tibetan Buddhist stupa, with its white dome and golden spire, began appearing in the Mongolian steppe and in the capital of Dodu, modern-day Beijing. This was a return trip with immense consequences. Buddhism, which had first entered Tibet centuries earlier from India and China, was now being re-exported north and east in a uniquely Tibetan form, packaged with a powerful political theology. The trade routes across the high steppe buzzed with a new kind of traffic, caravans carrying sacred texts, ritual objects, and red-robed monks, all moving under the direct sponsorship and protection of the world's most powerful empire. This patronage created a stable corridor for faith that outlasted the Mongol Empire itself, laying the foundation for the deep and enduring link between Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian culture that persists to this day. It shows us that when religion travels hand in hand with political power, it can forge bonds that redirect the spiritual currents of continents. Long before the Mongols unified the steppe, another imperial power had already mastered the art of connecting worlds. The great Persian empires, from the Achaemenids to the Sasanians, controlled the vital crossroads between East and West for over 1,000 years. Their official faith, Zoroastrianism, was not just a religion of kings and fire temples. It was the first state-sponsored belief system to travel the ancient trade routes, establishing a blueprint that later faiths would follow. Founded by the prophet Zarathustra, it presented a universe locked in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, with humanity holding the responsibility to choose the side of righteousness. This was a powerful theology for an empire, providing a divine mandate for order, justice, and the royal authority that upheld it. As Persian political and commercial influence radiated outward, so too did its spiritual framework. Along the royal road that stretched from the heart of Persia to the Aegean Sea, and eastward into the caravan cities of Central Asia, Zoroastrian ideas flowed as part of the imperial package. Fire temples where a sacred flame was kept perpetually burning as a symbol of divine truth became landmarks in trading settlements from Mesopotamia to the edges of the Taklamakan Desert. These were more than places of worship. They were cultural hubs where Persian administrative practices, artistic styles, and ethical concepts were disseminated. The religion's emphasis on truth-telling, contract-keeping, and environmental care resonated deeply with the merchant communities who were the lifeblood of these routes. A trader could find a familiar ethical code and a community that understood the importance of an honest oath, whether in a bazaar in Bactria or a caravanserai in Sogdiana. This early integration of faith and commerce created a durable pattern. It showed that a religion could serve as both a spiritual compass and a glue for social and economic networks across vast distances. The Persian model demonstrated that imperial support could give a belief system the stability and resources to project its influence far beyond its homeland, planting seeds in foreign soil that would sometimes grow in unexpected ways for centuries to come. The legacy of this transmission is written not in conquests, but in subtle, enduring echoes. Many of the core concepts that traveled with Zoroastrianism, the vision of a final judgment, the idea of a savior figure, the stark duality of good versus evil, and even the symbolism of angels, would later find recognizable reflections in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions that emerged within or near the sphere of Persian influence. This was not direct borrowing, but part of a long, slow conversation of ideas along the trade routes, where spiritual vocabulary was shared, debated, and reinterpreted. Yet the most direct and remarkable survival of this ancient faith is found not along the dusty inland trails, but on a distant shore. When Arab-Muslim armies conquered the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century, a chapter closed for Zoroastrianism in its homeland. Facing pressure, a group of the faithful made a desperate decision. They chose the sea. Sometime in the 8th or 9th century, a small community of Zoroastrians, later known as Parsis, sailed from Persia to the western coast of India. Legend says they were granted sanctuary by a local Hindu ruler, who showed them a full vessel of milk to signify his kingdom was full. The Parsi leader responded by stirring a spoonful of sugar into the milk, promising his community would blend in and sweeten society without overflowing it. This poetic agreement proved prophetic. Settling in Gujarat and later flourishing in Bombay, the Parsis became a merchant community par excellence. They thrived in shipbuilding, trade, and banking, all while meticulously preserving their ancient rituals. Their fire temples, where the sacred flame kindled over 1,000 years ago still burns, became centers of a resilient identity maintained through centuries. They achieved the ultimate merchant diaspora dream, becoming indispensable to their new home while keeping the flame of their ancestral faith alive. The Parsi story completes a profound circle. It shows a religion first spread by imperial power along land routes, then preserved by a mercantile community across maritime routes. From state religion to diaspora faith, Zoroastrianism's journey encapsulates the two great engines of religious transmission we have seen again and again. It moved by royal decree and by traders' necessity, proving that a belief could outlast the empire that first carried it, finding new life where the roads and the waves met. While empires and monks moved along the central highways, another ancient faith traced its own enduring path along the very edges of the map. Judaism, with its deep roots in the Near East, did not spread through royal patronage or mass conversion. Its journey across Asia was the story of a resilient diaspora, a network of communities that turned displacement into a unique form of influence. From the Mediterranean to the Chinese coast, Jewish merchants and families maintained their identity while becoming some of the most skilled cross-cultural connectors the ancient world ever knew. They thrived not in the spotlight of empires, but in the interstitial spaces between them, proving that a faith could travel and survive for centuries without a state, an army, or a homeland. Their story is written in the quiet corners of trade ledgers and personal letters, a testament to endurance through adaptation. Perhaps no group embodies this role more clearly than the Radhanites, a guild of Jewish merchants active from roughly the 8th to the 10th centuries. Their network was staggering in its reach. Historical accounts describe them speaking a multitude of languages, including Arabic, Persian, Greek, and the Romance tongues of Europe. They operated 4 major routes that spanned the known world. One went overland through Europe to the Slavic lands, another sailed from the Mediterranean to Egypt, then traveled overland to the Red Sea and onward by ship to India and China. A third crossed North Africa, and a fourth navigated the volatile currents of the Caspian and Black Seas. These were not casual traders. The Radhanites were the original global logistics experts, dealing in everything from spices and silks to more unusual commodities like swords, furs, and even enslaved individuals, a common and tragic reality of the medieval economic system. What set them apart was their ability to move across political and religious borders that were often closed to others. As a diasporic people with no political allegiance to a competing empire, they were viewed as relatively neutral agents. A Christian ruler in Europe, a Muslim caliph in Baghdad, and a Tang official in China could all do business with a Radhanite merchant without suspecting them of being a spy for a rival power. Their faith provided a portable, unifying law, the halakha, which governed everything from contract ethics to dietary practices, creating a bond of trust within their own far-flung community. They became the discrete arteries of exchange, moving goods and, inevitably, ideas between worlds that otherwise had little direct contact. This pattern of establishing resilient, trade-oriented communities repeated itself at the farthest ends of the routes. On the lush Malabar coast of southwestern India, a Jewish community thrived for possibly 2,000 years. The Cochin Jews, as they came to be known, traced their origins to traders arriving after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Local traditions speak of copper plates granted to their leader, Joseph Rabban, by a Hindu king in the 10th century. These plates, inscribed in the local Tamil language, bestowed upon the community specific rights to land, self-governance, and exemption from certain taxes. They were a charter of tolerance, allowing the Jews to live according to their own laws and customs. The community flourished in the port city of Cochin, building a beautiful synagogue in 1568 that still stands today, with hand-painted Chinese willow pattern floor tiles and Belgian crystal chandeliers, a perfect symbol of their interconnected world. They were pepper traders, ship owners, and advisors, fully integrated into the economic life of the Indian Ocean, while meticulously preserving their Sabbath observance, kosher laws, and Hebrew prayers. Their story is one of peaceful coexistence, showing how a diaspora community could find not just refuge, but an honored place within a profoundly different cultural fabric, sustained by the maritime trade that first brought them there. For centuries, the full scope of this Jewish diaspora network was known only in fragments. Then, in the late 19th century, a discovery in Cairo unlocked a hidden archive of everyday medieval life. In the Geniza, or storeroom, of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, scholars found nearly 300,000 documents, a chaotic treasure trove that had been preserved because Jewish tradition forbids the destruction of any text containing the name of God. This Cairo Geniza was not a library of great literary works. It was a centuries-old filing cabinet, filled with everything from marriage contracts and grocery lists to business letters and court records. For historians, it became a time machine. Through these fragile pages, we hear the voices of the Radhanite merchants themselves. We read a letter from a Jewish trader in India writing home to his business partner in Egypt, complaining about the slow market for lacquerware and describing the monsoon winds. We see a shopping list from a woman in Cairo requesting specific spices from the East. These documents, written in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic written in Hebrew script, map a living, breathing network of families and firms that stretched from Andalusia in Spain to the port of Mangalore in India. The Geniza does not tell a story of grand theological debate or imperial conversion. It reveals the mundane human mechanics of how faith endured on the road. It shows communities using their shared religious law to settle disputes across continents, sending charitable funds back to the scholarly centers in Jerusalem or Baghdad, and requesting prayer books or ritual items from their homeland. Their faith was the constant in a life of motion, the anchor that held fast while everything around them changed. They were the perennial connectors, their personal letters and legal documents weaving a web of trust that, in its own quiet way, helped hold the vast, fragmented world of medieval trade together. But what of the roads less traveled, the paths that did not connect global empires but linked two unique worlds across the roof of the world? While the Grand Silk Road and the maritime routes captured the spotlight, a quieter, more vertical highway was at work. This was the Tea Horse Road, a network of trails threading through some of the most treacherous mountain terrain on Earth, connecting the lush tea gardens of southwestern China with the high, arid plateau of Tibet. Its name reveals its purpose, a straightforward barter system. From China came compressed bricks of tea, a vital commodity for the Tibetan diet, where the high altitude and limited agriculture made tea infused with butter and salt a nutritional staple. From Tibet came the hardy, sure-footed horses bred on the plateau, which were highly prized by Chinese armies for their endurance. This was not trade on a casual scale. It was a state-managed, life-sustaining exchange that operated for over 1,000 years, creating a pulse of movement across the Himalayas. And with every caravan of tea bricks heading west and every drove of horses heading east, something far more subtle was being carried. This commercial artery became a dedicated conduit for Tibetan Buddhism flowing into China, and for Chinese artistic influence flowing back into Tibet. The constant, seasonal traffic of merchants, muleteers, and porters created a stable channel. Tibetan monks and scholars traveled to the great Buddhist centers of China, while Chinese artists, commissioned to produce religious art for Tibetan monasteries, brought their own stylistic sensibilities to the task. The tea itself was almost a form of spiritual currency. Communities of Tibetan Buddhist monks in Sichuan and Yunnan provinces often managed large tea plantations, using the profits to fund their monasteries and their scholarly exchanges. The very act of traveling the road was a meditation in endurance, with paths skirting sheer cliffs and crossing raging rivers on rope bridges, a journey that mirrored the spiritual path itself. The artifacts tell the story. In Tibetan monasteries, you can find beautifully detailed thankas, or scroll paintings, that blend the vibrant mineral pigments and iconic deities of Tibetan style with the delicate landscape elements and fluid lines characteristic of Chinese brush painting. Similarly, the magnificent Buddhist cave temples at sites like Dozu, though fundamentally Chinese in location and patronage, display a clear awareness of Tibetan tantric iconography that arrived via these mountain trails. This was a slow, intimate exchange, not of conquest but of mutual need and deepening artistic dialogue. It proves that the most profound connections sometimes form not on the open, cosmopolitan highways, but on the narrow, perilous paths where two civilizations meet out of sheer necessity, trading the leaves of one world for the strength of another, and in the process, quietly weaving their spiritual visions into one tapestry. These journeys of faith are not just stories passed down. They are written in stone, hidden in caves, and scattered across the ocean floor. To truly understand how beliefs traveled, we must turn from the grand narratives to the physical evidence left behind, the silent witnesses that speak across centuries. The most powerful of these are the inscriptions carved into stone, meant to last forever. We have already met the Xi'an stele, that towering testament to Nestorian Christianity in Tang, China. But it is not alone. Across Central Asia, you find tombstones marked with crosses and inscriptions in Syriac, tracing the diaspora of Christian communities along the caravan routes. In the port city of Gwangju, stone carvings depict Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic motifs side by side, a permanent record of the maritime melting pot. These steles were public declarations, intended to announce the presence and legitimacy of a faith to both the authorities and to future generations. They are frozen moments of arrival claiming a place in a new world. Far more personal and often more revealing are the manuscripts and letters that survived against all odds. The arid climate of the Taklamakan Desert acted as a perfect preservative. In the library cave at Dunhuang, sealed around the year 1000, monks cached tens of thousands of scrolls and paintings. This was not a random collection. It was a deliberate time capsule of Silk Road spirituality. Within this single cave, researchers found Buddhist sutras in Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Chinese, but also Manichaean hymns, Nestorian Christian texts, and even a Hebrew prayer for travelers. The paper, the inks, the scripts, and the languages themselves map a network of theological exchange. A single scroll might be written in Sogdian script but contain a Buddhist text translated from Chinese, a dizzying chain of transmission made tangible. These were working documents used by real communities, and their survival gives us a direct line to the intellectual and spiritual ferment of the oasis towns. The sea holds its own treasures, often discovered by accident. In the waters off the Indonesian island of Belitung, fishermen found the wreck of an Arab dhow dating to the 9th century. Its cargo was a snapshot of global trade: Chinese ceramics, gold and silverware from Persia, and raw materials from Southeast Asia. But among the chests of trade goods was a small, green glazed jar. Inside was a collection of finely wrought gold objects, including a cup decorated with a scene of dancers and musicians. The style was unmistakably Tang Chinese, but the function was likely ceremonial for a wealthy merchant or diplomat from the Islamic world. This single artifact, lost in a shipwreck, embodies the entire system. It is a luxury item from China, owned by a Muslim trader, traveling on an Arabian ship through Southeast Asian waters. It proves that the connections were not theoretical. They were material, intimate, and constantly in motion. Similarly, Hindu statues of deities like Ganesha and Shiva, recovered from shipwrecks in the Java Sea, tell us that religious icons were not just objects of worship, but also items of trade, diplomatic gifts, or personal possessions carried by devotees moving across the monsoon routes. Even the humble coin tells a profound story of connection. The discovery of Islamic dirhams, silver coins minted in Baghdad or Samarkand, in Viking hordes in Scandinavia, is one of history's great surprises. How did coins from the Caliphate end up buried under a Nordic field? The answer is the river road, the network of waterways that connected the Baltic Sea to the Caspian and Black Seas via the Volga and Dnieper rivers. Viking traders dealing in furs, amber, and honey would travel these rivers to trading centers like Bulgar, where they met Muslim merchants from the south. The dirhams, valued for their consistent silver content, became a preferred currency in the north. Each coin is a tiny, metallic proof of a transaction, a handshake between worlds that linked the pagan north with the Islamic south through the cold, clear logic of commerce. Where the coin traveled, awareness followed. A Norseman holding a dirham saw the unfamiliar script, the mention of Allah and the Prophet, a tangible piece of a distant faith arriving in his palm. Every artifact, from the monumental stele to the lost coin, is a dot on a map. When we connect these dots, the lines that appear are not random. They trace the precise paths of the caravan trails, the sailing routes of the monsoons, the river roads of the north. A Buddhist text in a Dunhuang cave got there because a monk walked a specific desert track. A Hindu statue on the ocean floor sank because a ship followed the seasonal winds. A Nestorian tombstone in Kyrgyzstan marks the final resting place of a merchant who stopped traveling. These objects did not move by magic. They were carried by the people whose lives we have followed. The evidence proves that the trade routes were not just conduits for silk and spices, but the very bloodstream of cultural exchange, carrying the DNA of belief to every corner of the ancient world. They ask us to look closer, to see in a faded manuscript or a waterlogged statue not just an artifact, but a journey completed, a prayer whispered in a foreign land, and a connection that refused to be broken by time or distance. A sacred text in a foreign tongue is just a beautiful artifact, not a living faith. This simple truth reveals the intellectual engine that powered every journey of belief we have witnessed. For a religion to move from being a traveler's curiosity to a community's cornerstone, it had to learn to speak the language of its new home. This was not a matter of convenience but of survival. The translation of sacred texts, prayers, and core concepts was the single most critical act of cultural transplantation. Without it, the deepest meanings remained locked away, accessible only to a tiny elite of foreign scholars or merchants. Translation was the key that turned a locked door into an open gateway. Consider the monumental task facing Buddhism as it entered China. The Chinese intellectual world was already ancient and sophisticated, built upon the philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism. It had its own precise terms for virtue, the cosmos, and the path to harmony. Buddhist monks from India and Central Asia arrived with thousands of sutras, dense philosophical discourses written in Sanskrit or Pali. To simply transliterate these terms would have rendered them meaningless noise. Instead, teams of translators embarked on a centuries-long project of profound cultural interpretation. They became linguistic alchemists. For the Buddhist concept of Dharma, the cosmic law and teaching, they sometimes used the Taoist term Tao, the way. For nirvana, the ultimate liberation, they borrowed a term meaning extinction or quenching, evoking the blowing out of a flame. This was not a loss in translation, but a creative gain. It allowed Chinese scholars to approach these radical new ideas through a familiar conceptual vocabulary, creating a unique Sino-Buddhist tradition that felt both foreign and deeply resonant. The government sometimes sponsored vast translation bureaus like the one at the Great Goose Pagoda in Chang'an, where hundreds of scholars worked in concert. This official support signaled that the faith was not just a peripheral cult, but a body of knowledge worthy of the empire's greatest minds. The same imperative shaped the spread of Islam across the Malay archipelago. When Muslim traders from Gujarat and Arabia brought their faith to the ports of Sumatra and Java, they faced a world without a tradition of Arabic literacy. The Quran, considered the literal word of God in Arabic, presented a unique challenge. The solution was both practical and ingenious. Scholars began writing the local Malay language using a modified Arabic script, creating what we now call Jawi script. This did more than just transcribe sounds. It created a direct visual and cognitive bridge between the sacred language of revelation and the everyday language of the people. Religious texts, legal codes, and epic poetry were composed in Jawi, seamlessly weaving Islamic terminology and concepts into the fabric of Malay thought. A farmer hearing a verse of the Quran recited in Arabic might feel its spiritual power, but reading a commentary on its meaning in his own language, written in the elegant script of the faith, allowed that power to take root in his understanding. This linguistic fusion made Islam feel not like an imported Arab identity, but a universal truth that could be expressed in a distinctly Southeast Asian voice. Translation went far beyond words on a page. It was about translating entire worldviews. When Nestorian Christians in China described their faith as the Luminous religion and used Buddhist terms for angels, they were translating a cosmology. When Sufi mystics in India used local musical traditions and love poetry to express divine yearning, they were translating an experience of the heart. Every metaphor chosen, every parallel drawn, was a deliberate act of building a bridge. The goal was comprehension, not just conversion. A belief system that refuses to translate itself condemns itself to remaining forever a stranger. But one that undertakes the difficult, respectful work of finding new words for eternal truths does something remarkable. It invites the local culture into a conversation, allowing that culture to reshape the expression of the faith even as the faith reshapes the culture. This mutual transformation is the quiet, intellectual miracle that happened at caravanserai scriptoriums and port city madrasas, where the rustle of parchment and the murmur of debate were the sounds of worlds connecting. The trade routes carried the physical texts, but it was the translators who unlocked their soul, ensuring that what arrived as a foreign scripture could eventually be whispered as a native prayer. Yet this journey of translation and adaptation had a profound and inevitable consequence. When a belief system arrives in a new land, it never remains a perfect copy of itself. It enters into a conversation with the local spirit of the place, with its deep-rooted customs, its ancestral memories, and its own ways of seeing the world. The result is not a replacement but a creative fusion, a local remix. Scholars call this syncretism, but we can think of it as a spiritual dialogue where both the arriving faith and the receiving culture are changed by the encounter. This blending was not a sign of weakness or impurity, but the very mechanism by which abstract doctrines became living, breathing traditions that people could love and defend. Consider the journey of Buddhism once it settled into the Chinese landscape. The celestial pantheon of Indian Buddhism, with its array of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, began to feel familiar to Chinese devotees in a very specific way. The compassionate Bodhisattva Guanyin, originally a male figure known as Avalokiteshvara, gradually transformed in the Chinese imagination. By the Song dynasty, around 1,000 years ago, Guanyin was almost universally depicted as a graceful, merciful goddess, often shown holding a child. This shift was no accident. It resonated with deeply held Chinese values of maternal kindness and family continuity, and it filled a niche for a compassionate female deity that other local traditions emphasized less. Similarly, the Buddha of the Western Pure Land, Amitabha, became associated with the Taoist concept of an immortal paradise, a land of ultimate bliss that promised an accessible salvation for ordinary people. The faith did not just translate its texts, it adapted its very iconography to speak directly to the hopes and fears of its new audience. Far to the west, along the Silk Road and across the steppe, a similar process was unfolding with Sufi Islam. The mystical brotherhoods that carried the faith into Central Asia and Anatolia did not arrive with a blank slate. They encountered populations with ancient shamanic traditions, where spiritual leaders communicated with the spirit world through ecstatic dance, music, and poetry. The Sufis, seeking their own ecstatic union with the divine, found a powerful resonance here. Rather than suppressing these customs, they often incorporated their essence. The rhythmic, turning dance of the Mevlevi order, known as the whirling dervishes, became a moving meditation to achieve spiritual ascent. In other regions, the use of drums, flutes, and hypnotic chanting in Sufi ceremonies echoed older shamanic rituals, now redirected toward the remembrance of God. Local saints and holy figures, sometimes venerated at ancient sacred sites like trees or springs, were gently reinterpreted within an Islamic framework, becoming awliya, or friends of God. This was not a compromise of doctrine, but a brilliant strategy of connection. It allowed people to step into Islam through a door that felt familiar, transforming ancestral practices into a new form of devotion that still honored the deep, intuitive spirituality of the land. This creative fusion reached its most spectacular visual expression in ancient Java. The great temple of Borobudur, which we visited earlier, is a Buddhist monument through and through. But just a few decades later, and not far away, the rulers of the same Mataram kingdom built the stunning temple complex of Prambanan, a masterpiece dedicated to the Hindu trimurti of Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. This was not a case of one faith displacing the other. Evidence suggests that the same royal family, the same artisans, and the same society seamlessly supported both. The two religions existed in a state of dynamic synthesis now called Hindu-Buddhist syncretism. A king might be posthumously depicted as the Hindu god Shiva, yet also be praised in inscriptions for his Buddhist piety. In daily practice, the distinction often blurred. The indigenous spiritual world of Java, with its reverence for ancestral spirits and natural forces, provided a common foundation upon which both the intricate rituals of Hinduism and the philosophical paths of Buddhism could be built. This was a truly pluralistic spiritual ecosystem where the boundaries between faiths were porous and the divine could be approached through multiple, complementary doors. These examples from China, Central Asia, and Java reveal a universal truth about how belief travels. The trade routes delivered the raw materials, the core texts and doctrines. But the final product, the religion as it was actually lived and experienced, was always assembled locally. It was shaped by the local climate, the local history, and the local heart. This adaptive process ensured that the faith could put down deep roots, becoming not a foreign import, but a natural expression of the culture itself. The global became local, and in doing so, it gained the power to endure. But this vibrant world of connection was not permanent. The same roads that carried enlightenment could also carry conflict, and when they closed, the consequences for faith were profound. A sudden shift in the political winds could sever a lifeline, leaving once thriving religious communities stranded, isolated, and vulnerable. The collapse of the great unifying empires often triggered this contraction, turning open highways back into dangerous frontiers. After the Mongol Empire fragmented in the 14th century, the Pax Mongolica shattered. The successor states frequently turned inward, fighting each other for dominance. Banditry resurged, and the once meticulously maintained relay stations fell into disrepair. Travel became risky and expensive again, not just for merchants, but for the monks, scholars, and pilgrims who depended on that safe passage. The flow of people, texts, and ideas slowed to a trickle. For a faith like Nestorian Christianity in Central Asia, this was a slow strangulation. its strength had always been its networked diaspora, its ability to draw support and clergy from its heartlands in Persia and Mesopotamia. As the routes grew insecure, that connection withered. Isolated bishoprics in oasis towns could no longer easily communicate with their patriarch or receive trained priests. They became cultural islands, their practices increasingly blending with local Buddhist or shamanic traditions until their distinct identity faded. Without the constant refreshment of theological exchange and communal solidarity from the wider church, these communities were often absorbed or simply disappeared from the historical record. Their decline was not a failure of faith, but a demonstration of how fragile a networked religion could be when its network collapsed. Similarly, the once bustling interfaith hubs of Sogdian merchant quarters dwindled as trade patterns shifted south to the maritime routes or were disrupted by new waves of conquest. The marketplace of ideas required a functioning marketplace, and when commerce retreated, the vibrant pluralism it supported often retreated with it. This pattern of contraction was not always slow. Sometimes it was violently accelerated. The rise of powerful, exclusive states or militant movements could deliberately target the very openness the trade routes represented. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as new empires solidified their borders with stricter religious identities, the old porousness of the Silk Road began to harden. Some rulers, seeking to enforce doctrinal purity or consolidate power, viewed the religious pluralism of the caravan cities as a threat. This could lead to the suppression of minority faiths, the destruction of temples or churches, and the expulsion of communities whose beliefs were now deemed foreign or heretical. When the roads were no longer safe for certain kinds of travelers, their unique cargo of belief simply stopped arriving. The result was a religious map that became more patchwork and isolated. Regions that had once been crossroads of conversation turned into quieter, more homogeneous spiritual landscapes. This isolation could also preserve, but in a different way. Cut off from the evolving debates and reforms of their parent traditions, isolated communities might conserve ancient practices long after they had changed elsewhere, like a linguistic fossil. Yet more often, isolation meant a gradual dwindling, a fading of the light as the last priests passed and the sacred texts crumbled, untranslated for a new generation. The closing of a route was more than a trade disruption. It was a silencing of dialogue. It reminds us that the exchange of belief was a delicate ecosystem, flourishing in conditions of security and mutual interest, but highly susceptible to the frost of political change and conflict. The open road giveth, and the closed road taketh away. The gentle rhythm of the monsoon winds was about to meet the roar of cannon fire. In the year 1498, a Portuguese fleet under Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Indian Ocean, a world that had governed its own exchange for 1,000 years. They did not arrive as just another group of merchants seeking a place at the table. They came with a radically different model, one that would begin to fracture the ancient, organic systems we have followed. The Portuguese crown did not see trade as a mutual exchange between equals. They saw it as a right to be enforced and a monopoly to be claimed by the direct application of naval power. Their ships were not just transports, they were floating fortresses designed to control sea lanes and dominate port cities. Almost immediately, they began seizing key strategic points like Goa in India, Malacca in Malaysia, and Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. Their goal was not to integrate into the existing network, but to control its choke points, taxing all who passed and redirecting the flow of wealth directly back to Lisbon. This was armed trade, a concept that fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. For centuries, the safety of a merchant in an Indian Ocean port had depended on the goodwill of the local ruler and the shared interest of all parties in keeping commerce flowing. Now it could depend on the allegiance to a distant European king and the threat of bombardment from the harbor. This shift from a multipolar, networked system to a centralized, coercive one began to harden the soft borders of the spiritual marketplace. The Portuguese arrival also introduced a new and forceful element into the journey of faith. Their mission was framed as a dual conquest for spices and for souls under the banner of the Padroado, a royal patronage granted by the Pope. While earlier religious travelers had moved through persuasion, adaptation, and example, the Portuguese often pursued a policy of enforced conversion, particularly in territories they directly controlled. In Goa, Hindu temples were destroyed and the public practice of non-Christian faiths was suppressed. The Inquisition was established, creating a climate of fear and conformity. This represented a stark departure from the older patterns. A Sufi mystic might spend a lifetime earning trust to share his message. A Buddhist monk would translate sutras to make them comprehensible. The Portuguese model, in its most aggressive form, sought to replace rather than translate, to demand cultural surrender as the price of survival or commercial access. It set a precedent that other European powers would follow, intertwining evangelical zeal with imperial ambition in a way that would redefine religious encounter for centuries to come. The older, fluid exchanges did not vanish overnight. In many areas, especially beyond the reach of Portuguese guns, the ancient rhythms persisted. Muslim merchants from Gujarat and Arabia continued their voyages. Jewish traders maintained their networks. The tea-horse road still wound through the mountains, but a rupture had occurred. The Indian Ocean was no longer a neutral highway governed by the wind and mutual interest. It was becoming a contested space, its routes claimed by flags and its ports guarded by forts. The era where religions traveled primarily on the currents of commerce and curiosity was giving way to an era where they would increasingly travel in the wake of empires. This was the noisy, violent dawn of a new global age, one that would eventually shrink the world through steam and steel, but in the process would forever change the ancient, patient art of how belief moves across the earth. The arrival of European canons signaled a new chapter, but it could not erase the profound legacy already woven into the land. The story of Asia's spiritual landscape is not one of isolated temples or static traditions. It is the story of movement, of a living network that breathed across mountains and seas. Those medieval trade routes were far more than economic corridors. They were a great, invisible conveyor belt for the human soul, carrying beliefs as deliberately as any bale of silk or sack of pepper. This constant, patient traffic of ideas across thousands of miles is what painted the diverse spiritual map we recognize across Asia today, a mosaic where Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity found homes far from their birthplaces. This legacy is not locked away in history books. It walks the streets of the modern world. You can see it in the graceful minarets of Indonesian mosques that echo Javanese temple architecture, or in the Chinese Buddhist monasteries that still preserve rituals filtered through Tibetan interpretations. You can hear it in the shared vocabulary of spirituality that resonates across linguistic borders, and you can feel it in the cultural DNA of cities that were once caravan hubs or port emporiums, places where pluralism is an ancient habit, not a modern idea. The ultimate lesson of this entire journey is a deeply human one. It reveals a dual longing that has always driven us forward. We are creatures who seek both material sustenance and spiritual meaning, and throughout history, these two pursuits have been inextricably linked. The merchant sought profit but also blessing for his journey. The monk sought enlightenment but relied on the merchant's road to carry his teachings. Their paths converged on the same dusty trails and moonlit decks, proving that commerce and faith are not opposites, but often the twin engines of human connection. They built bridges not with declarations but with dialogues, one translated text, one shared meal, one trusted partnership at a time. If this exploration has changed how you see the threads connecting our world, consider diving deeper. What other hidden histories are woven into the fabric of the places around you? Your curiosity is the next step in this endless journey of connection.